Good morning, everybody. My name is Fergus Dolan, and I work with NALA. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning for our Building Reading Relationships webinar. We're delighted to have Dr. Rebecca Long. Rebecca is Primary and Junior Cycle Coordinator for the Trinity College Dublin Access Programme. So over to you, Rebecca. And just if you've joined in the last minute, what we said was that Rebecca would speak for half an hour or more or less, and then we'll ask you for your questions. So if at any stage during Rebecca's talk or at the end, if a question or a comment or your piece of advice pops into your head, please feel free to put it in. There's a question stroke chat box that you have down near the bottom of your toolbar. Click on that and just write in your question or your chat. So over to you, Rebecca.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Fergus. As well as my role as the Primary and Junior Cycle Coordinator in the Access Programme in Trinity College, I also do work with Children's Books Ireland. So I've been a book doctor with them since 2016, and I also edit the 10 to YA section in Inish magazine, which is sort of a reviews and articles magazine for children's literature. I'm just going to start my PowerPoint now, and as Fergus said again, please ask questions as we go along, and we'll get to them at the end. And just to draw attention to my email there, it's Becky, BECKY @ta21.ie. And for any sort of longer and more involved questions that you might have, I would really love to hear them. As I said to Fergus at the beginning, what I'm hoping to talk to you about today is a mixture of sort of established research, established critical research, my own experience, and also just some practical tips that I think everyone can use. But this is a dynamic thing. The children and the way they read, it's an ever-changing concept and experience. And any questions at all are very, very, very valuable to me. So look at it that way. You're doing me a favor if you ask questions. Okay, so we'll get started then. I don't want to sort of overwhelm everyone with this, sort of like critical frameworks or anything, but there are a couple of important critical thinkers that I want to talk about at the start of the webinar that really informed my research during my PhD, but also the way that I interact with children in Children's Books Ireland book clinics. I'll very quickly tell you how the book clinics actually work before I get stuck into ISER. So, at festivals or libraries around the country, obviously during normal times, and we've moved them onto digital platforms now. The book doctors, I'm one of about 7, I think, at this stage. We invite children to come to us to talk about the books that they love, the books that they don't love, to tell us their preferences, and then we make reading recommendations, is what we call them, and we have a reading passport that we fill out for the children to give them ideas about what to read next. And very often I found that, depending on the area of the country, the demographic of the children coming to the book clinics, you find yourself engaging with the whole family and not just with the child that's sitting in front of you. And as I say, depending on the area and depending on the sort of the background of the families, I've come across a lot of parents who feel that, reading has kind of left them behind, that it's too late for them to get on board, but it's something that they very much want for their children. And I found that quite compelling, that this idea that adults have sort of decided that, it's too late for them. And even if they weren't readers themselves as children, they want it for their children now. And that led me to think about, the importance of reading, not just on a sort of a high-minded kind of critical scale, but on an individual scale, and the difference that it can make both to children and to adults. And that's the idea of the reading relationship. And we'll talk a little bit about that as I go further on. But this quote here seems very, very long. It was just that I just decided to copy and paste it from part of my PhD research. But the basic idea that Wolfgang Iser talks about in The Implied Reader, and even though it was first published in 1974, I think it's still incredibly relevant today, is this idea of the virtual dimension of the text. And it's the notion that a text, a book, a picture book, even a film, all of these things are texts. All of them involve reading or interpreting images and dialogue and the combination of both. That a book or a story is never complete until a reader comes to it, until a reader actually interacts with it. So there's a kind of a lovely synergy or a relationship between the reader and the text that produces this virtual dimension, as Iser said, it's the imagination of the reader, the coming together of text and imagination. So there's a lovely sort of moment of production where meaning actually happens, and that the text itself is, and I find there's a lovely way to talk to children about it, that the book is waiting for them to come and read it, because that's when the book comes to life. And that the reader, in establishing these sort of connections between the past and the present and the future, actually helps the text to reveal its multiple meanings. And what Iser meant by that idea of past, present, and future really is what the reader brings to the book. That every single reader will bring something different, because of course every reader is individual. Every reader has had different experiences, comes from a different culture, comes from a different family. So all of that is so important in the actual reading experience, or the creation of the story, really, because that's what Iser thinks, that the reader is essential to the creation of the book itself. And J. Appleyard is another critic that was essential to my research. So my PhD was in children's literature, specifically Irish children's literature, and the idea of cultural heritage in Irish children's books. And I had a particular focus on this idea of developing identities and how children look for a sort of a multiplicity of childhoods within books, that the more they're exposed to the ideas of different experiences and different lives, the more empathetic they become, the more sort of self-aware but also socially aware they become as well. And J. Appleyard did an awful lot of work on this idea that the reader, as he says, comes to the text in a very specific way, culturally, socially, personally, again, building on what Iser talks about with his implied reader notion. And he says that the reader's development is in part socially constructed, and that it's an artifact both of the history of literary invention and of the particular cultural experiences that prepares the reader to read. And I always was very struck by that idea of the particular cultural experiences. And to me, through my interpretation and my experience, that means very much the familial experiences. Because when a child is small, sort of pre-learning to read or learning to read, their family is their culture, their family is their world, their society, their community. So it's almost like we say in the Access program that when an Access student goes to college, the whole family goes to college. It's the same thing, I think, with reading, that when a child learns to read, the whole family is involved in that in one way, shape, or form. And, depending on the previous associations with reading, or the adults in the family, their own experiences, it can perhaps be a positive or a negative influence that occurs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And this idea of narrative structure, I was really interested in what children get from reading, essentially, and why reading is so important. And Todorov has this notion that all of narrative structure, every story is built on this idea of equilibrium that moves to disequilibrium, that moves to an equilibrium that's restored. So there's a sort of a discernible pattern in all of the stories that we read and in all of the stories that we tell, and that children respond particularly to this because they like that idea of not necessarily predictability, but familiarity and security, in that they know that when they start out a particular story, they will identify with the characters, that these characters will go through some kind of adversity, or they'll have to solve some kind of problem, and that the story will resolve itself at the end, but that these characters will be different, that the equilibrium at the end is not the same as the equilibrium at the start. And that's an incredibly important structure for children to encounter in books, and it applies to the simplest picture book right up to the most complicated sort of classic text as well. And you see it particularly in fairy tales, something as I have here in the PowerPoint, something like Little Red Riding Hood or Beauty and the Beast. There are reasons that we retell these stories, because they help us to teach children how to be in our societies. And obviously those particularly social mores and cultural values evolve over generations and over centuries, but the sort of the fundamental basics are still there. And so for generations, we have realized as societies and as communities that telling stories is an incredibly productive way of helping children to move into the world and to become themselves, and to give them essentially a structure that lets them experience the world without having to leave their own front door. And that's incredibly important, that they can experience through reading. And that's just as valuable sometimes as real world experience, if that makes sense. And this lady specifically, I would highly urge everyone to try and pick up a copy of Talk, Knowledge and Identity. Janet Maben is incredibly readable. I don't say that lightly, because most critics are not readable at all, ironically. She is a children's education practitioner, and I think that's what influences her readability so much. She's incredibly practical, and an awful lot of her research is based on her own experience as an educator. But she has this notion that children's talk it's referential because it allows them to describe the world. It's interpersonal in that it allows them to connect to people emotionally and physically in a way as well, because when we play out stories, they take on a physical element. And it's also emotive, that it allows them to get to know themselves, to put words on their feelings, to articulate themselves. And that she says this idea of the two important uses of narrative: to evaluate experience and present the self. So knowing how to tell stories is an incredibly important developmental process for children. And it has multiple functions. It allows them to have a sense of themselves in time. It allows them to communicate with others around them, and even I've talked to parents of older children at book clinics, that the more children read, the more capable they are of communicating their feelings and their experiences to their parents. So, you might not think it, but that for teenagers, reading books actually helps them to communicate with their parents, that the more they read, the more likely they are to want to share their emotions. Because very fundamentally, there was a reason that C.S. Lewis wrote that we read to know that we're not alone, that within reading is an incredible reservoir of emotion and experience that we can access, as I say, without leaving our own front doors. So as I say, I cannot recommend Janet Maben's Children's Voices enough. And she has this wonderful way of articulating the fact that when children use imaginative play, they are quite literally learning how to be in the world. And it goes back to something that J.A. Appleyard talks about as well, that we can present books to children that allow them to, as I say, experience the world, to see anxious situations, to see troubled times, but to know that there will be a resolution at the end. So that narrative, and that idea of narrative structure, going back to equilibrium, disequilibrium, and equilibrium restored, gives them a sort of a framework through which they can see the world. And an awful lot of it is implied, an awful lot of it is subjective, but there is this sense that things make sense, that there's a logic to how we can live our lives, and that, that social and cultural mores have an influence on who we are as people, and in that contract that we have with each other, that social contract. And again, this, the importance of play. I know that this is from the primary school curriculum 1999, and obviously this changed since then, but the fundamentals still remain. The importance of play in a child's development is fundamental. And I think sometimes we distinguish between, of course, we distinguish between play and reading, because one is seen as a sort of a solitary activity, reading, and play can be seen as a very communal activity, but they each inform the other. That the more ideas children are exposed through reading, the more imaginative their play will be, the more enriched their play will be, and that what they read in books can be acted out through their play. And Janet Maben talks about the fact that children being able to retell stories is also incredibly important, that where they situate themselves in the stories they tell is fundamental to the way that their identities develop. And as I say, to that communication between their peers, but also between the adults in their lives as well. This idea of make-believe, the make-believe world, as the curriculum says, provides the stimulus and the context through which they learn to represent things symbolically. And that allows them then to project that onto the world and to say, well, in this game, this happens. So perhaps in the real world, certain consequences occur as well. So reading and play are very interconnected. And I think sometimes that we can fall into a trap of reading being a prescribed activity and play being, free time that a child earns, or it has very positive connotations, when actually play and reading can both have those positive connotations. that the ideas that come from reading can inform the play that occurs afterwards as well. So this is where we can kind of get onto sort of the practical tips and the ideas of building reading relationships. Language experiences are incredibly important for children, and this begins from the moment a child is born, that the more words a child hears, the more words they collect, that the more the adults and older children in their lives speak to younger children, the more proficient they'll become with their own language as well. So the language experiences that occur, say, from 0 to 2 years of age, have a huge influence on the linguistic and cognitive development of children as they get older, as they enter school as well. Talking is so fundamentally important, not only between children, but between children and adults as well. And I've touched on that idea of communication before, that when the groundwork is set, when a child is younger, that idea of this is not an official term, but I've come up with it, storyifying experience, that when you ask children to tell you stories about their day, this is building again on that idea of the creative imagination, the importance of being able to see themselves as relational to the world, that their place in the world is important and that they deserve to be able to tell stories about their days. And that very often it's easier to tell a story than it is to give an itemized list of actions or of emotions. That by building these things into a story, children learn how to communicate more effectively and how to connect more effectively as well. Reading routines, I think, are also incredibly important. I touched on that idea before of, narrative structure, and that while you're not looking necessarily for repetition, and I'm not saying that children respond particularly well to repetition, but familiarity. If children learn that, after a bath, a book is to be read, or going to bed means reading, this is incredibly important because they learn to associate the act of reading with connection, with personal time with their parents or with the older adults in their lives. And embedding this at a young age, really, it allows the child to take reading for granted. And this is what we want. We want children not to see reading as a sort of as I say, a pastime that has to be earned, or something that is in its own way set aside from everyday life. We want to see it integrated. We want to see children picking up books and leafing through them with abandon. We don't want books to be something special. We want books to be on offer all of the time. And stories are the same thing, that the more the parents share stories, the better it is for the child listening. And creating a reading environment builds on that as well. And it's an extremely simple idea. I've even noticed it myself with book clinics. In previous times, I've held book clinics at places like Electric Picnic in the children's area, in Bloom in the Phoenix Park, the festivals, in libraries that, even though they should be quiet, they're quite busy. And it can be hard, to hold a child's attention, particularly younger children, but even older children too, when there's an awful lot going on in their environment. So what I mean by creating a reading environment is giving a child the best shot at having a decent go at a book. And by that I mean a quiet corner that the child can almost call their own, a comfortable chair, a nice dimly lit room, cozy, or even a particular special place in the garden outside, that there's just a sort of a protective bubble built around the reader. And I don't mean to isolate them from the rest of the household. That's not what I mean, but just to create this sense that, reading is a special thing and you deserve a bit of peace and quiet to do it. And that idea that, a child will perhaps pick up a book in the middle of a busy morning, when everyone's sharing breakfast together. And that might be their way of losing themselves in the book, and that's great. But at the same time, it's lovely to have a sort of a designated time and space for reading as well within the home. And these are sort of essential reading skills. And these are not, these are from my own experience. And it's kind of, they're phrases that I've kind of come up with myself to sort of quantify what I found from working with parents and with children. And the basics start with letter knowledge, that children can differentiate between different letters, and that they understand that the letter A looks different from the letter B, and that they mean different things. And that's what we call a shape skill. So helping children to recognize shapes is incredibly important here. Even when they're small, when they're playing with blocks, the difference between a square and a triangle, or a ball and a cube, this kind of thing will help them with their letter knowledge as they get a little bit older and as they start to learn to read. And the word awareness we've talked about already. It's this idea of talking to children and also of exposing them to words, even as they pick up board books when they're very, very small. That idea that words exist on a page or on a piece of cardboard printed. And they need to be able to know that you can break words down into their sort of constituent syllables. And that doesn't have to be a complicated thing. And I think it can be very overwhelming for parents of younger children, especially in the preschool years, where there's this pressure to, should I be teaching my child to read? And like, no, not necessarily, but you can do things that will help children to have a sort of a head start when it comes to the actual business of learning to read. And like I say, word awareness is part of that. Reading poetry, nursery rhymes, songs, all of these teach children that words behave differently sometimes, and that words rhyme, they sound the same. So all of that will help, that kind of repetition of sounds and phrases, particularly, as I say, in songs. And the vocabulary it's exactly what it says on the tin. The more words that children hear, the more words they'll be able to recognize, the more words they'll be able to use. And I think, the more the children are chatted to, essentially, the more the children are included in the sort of the daily conversations at the house, the more it'll stand to them as they go to school. And it's proven that the more exposure children have to conversational words, the better they do in school going forward. So all of these sort of activities, or the sharing essentially of words and talk in the early years, the progress that children make increases exponentially throughout their school lives as well. And I've touched a little bit on that idea of story skills, that the ability to narrate the self is very important, particularly for young children, because it essentially gives them a space within which they can work out their feelings. They're sort of their particular child logic of things and what they encounter in the world. And the more they can tell a story about things, the more they're able to order it in their own head. That when they learn that stories have beginnings, middles, and ends, they're able to apply that to their own experiences then. And it becomes a way to help them process, literally to process their daily lives, and to figure out, the importance of memories, or the importance of sharing their feelings and emotions with the people in their lives. So that's essentially what story skills are. That, reading stories helps children to tell stories, and not only creative stories, but stories about themselves as well. And that's what we do when we talk. We share stories that are based on our own experiences. Now, these were the reading toolkits were something that I developed when I was doing a radio show for RTE Junior. It was called The Word, and it was essentially sort of a magazine show, a mix of younger children coming in to review books with me, and then sort of like a tips column essentially for parents. And these 4 tools for the toolkit seem to work surprisingly well for parents, particularly for those who are trying to support reluctant readers or struggling readers. And it's just about making the reading experience lovely, essentially. And these can apply to children as young as junior infants, and then to expand them as they get older. But that idea of the personalized bookmark, it lets children feel like they have a certain sense of agency and independence when they're reading. And even if it's a bookmark that's used in a picture book that only has 30 pages, it lets them see the progress that they're making. It lets them decide when the reading session starts and when it concludes as well. And anything at all to give children a sense of independence and a sense that they're in control, I think is incredibly important. And it can be decorated to within an inch of its life as well, which is great, which is always great fun too. Now, the super dictionary is something that I myself have used in certain situations with parents who, as I say, have come to me with children who are struggling, or with children who are actually very advanced readers and who end up taking on books that are actually maybe a little bit too advanced for them at the time. And it can be a bit of a blow when a child has to admit that a book is too hard for them, and that sense of having to give it up, because I'm not older. Those are all sort of like pejorative connotations. So with the super dictionary, say at the end of a chapter or the end of a reading session, any words within that particular book that a child hasn't understood, they make a list in their notebook, and then the parent goes through them with the child with the dictionary. And the important thing is it's not just a simple case of looking up each word in the dictionary and memorizing its meaning. The original sentence in the book is also recorded in the child's notebook. So then they end up with a sort of a personalized dictionary. I'll give you an example. I used this myself as a young child. It was my mother's idea. And I remember reading The City Cats by Colin Dann when I was about 9. And really, that book has a reading age of maybe 12 to 14, if not a little bit older. And there was in the very first sentence, there was a word that I didn't understand, and it was disperse. And to this day, whenever I hear the word disperse, I think of cats dispersing out of a field in the early morning, because that was the sentence that actually ingrained its meaning in my own vocabulary. So it really, really does work, and it takes that sort of effort of learning words in isolation out of a child's reading life, and to contextualize everything is incredibly important. Now, the thought book, or I suppose it's a reading journal, really. It works for some children, particularly those who, take a lot on board, particularly those readers who are especially sensitive, and they might, necessarily be drawn to more of the issue books or historical fiction books that are more emotional rather than action driven. And they might end up with an awful lot of questions after a particular chapter, or, just coming to the end of a particular book. And I find that it's helpful for them to write this as though it's a diary, like a reading diary or a journal, and then to chat through them then with their parents or guardians, just because there are a lot of things that children don't understand straight off the bat because they are inexperienced readers. And the more that we talk about these things, the more inclined a child will be to come to their parents with, more serious questions later on. And that rather than having them finish a book that they didn't completely understand, if they can glean even more meaning and more experience from it by having a chat with their parents after having distilled these thoughts into the journal, then that's incredibly valuable as well. And the reading compass is essentially the parent or guardian in the child's life, because if a child sees a parent or guardian reading, then that's a role model right there, and they'll know that reading is important and is special in that house too. But it's connected to that idea of the other three sort of tools, that a parent, who's open to questions, who's open to talking with their child about books and about ideas, that's somebody that they can come to in a lot of different contexts, which is fantastic. And I suppose the stages of reading development, again, these are stages that I've kind of compiled myself just from experience of children at book clinics and talking to parents and working with them. And in that stage 1, obviously it's learning to read, and that's anything from 0 to 4. And these stages, you can sort of, very rigidly say that stage 1 is 0 to 4 and stage 2 is 4 to 6. Children are individuals, and each of these stages will apply to different children at different ages, and sometimes they might move backwards from stage 3 to stage 2. And learning to read encompasses everything that we've talked about already, that idea of building reading relationships and routines, talking to children, helping them with their word awareness. That learning to read actually starts an awful lot earlier than people actually think, and that there are so many ways to enrich a child's reading life before they even learn how to read. And with the stage 2 and the independent reading skills, this is when, I suppose technically I would say this is when children, have learned to read and are engaging with school life. So anything from sort of maybe senior infants upwards, and that they're actively going to books themselves, maybe bringing books to a parent in order to read together, or for them to read to their parents. And it's this idea that they own their reading now, that they know that they can do it, and it's something that they love and something that they enjoy. And stage 3, the reading with absorption, this moves sort of beyond the ticking the box of the mechanical reading skills. We like to see children, that when they read with intonation, and they read with a sense of performance, and that their comprehension is good as well. But this reading with absorption is really the ability to lose themselves in a text. And as I say, this can happen, from anything from age 6 upwards, or, it might be even later on in the child's reading life, or sooner. It depends on the child's capacity and their aptitude and their opportunity to read as well. And with stage 4, this idea of critical reading, like stage 4 lasts, well into, like, I would consider myself still in stage 4, developing that idea of critical reading, of having opinions about the books that you read, having ideas, wanting to research more because you've read a certain thing in a book, really identifying with characters and with the themes and with what the author, is trying to say, and reading between the lines, this kind of thing that you can pull more out of the book than maybe you would have had on the first reading. And I find classic texts are a great way to sort of give an example for stage 4, in that I remember myself, I read Jane Eyre first when I was 12. And of course, that reading was absolutely valid. I was coming to it as a reader, as a girl of age 12 who had her own particular ideas about the world and who identified very much with the character of Jane Eyre. But as a young adult returning to it at 16, I had another layer of meaning added to my reading of the text. And again, in college, as a critic and a scholar, another layer of meaning is added as well. So these are books that respond particularly well to multiple readings and to changes in our own experience, our own development as readers. And I suppose when choosing books, I think some parents can kind of feel very sort of overwhelmed with the idea of choosing books, primarily because I think the children's book market, particularly in Ireland, has exploded over the last 10 to 15 years, and there are a lot of books on the market, and it can feel very overwhelming, I think, when you try to pick a particular book for a particular child. And I find that particularly book clinics, parents are very much drawn to the big names, the sort of the celebrity books like the David Walliams or the Dermot O'Learys, because they're easy, they're very identifiable, it's very easy to find information about them. And that's fine. Like, I would never discourage a child from reading a particular book, because reading is reading, and you never want to discourage a child from picking up a book if they're naturally drawn to it. But what we also want is for books to ask something of the reader. You really ideally want a child to get something out of every book that they read, and be that in terms of vocabulary, of language, or ideas or experience, just something that basically sets their souls on fire a little bit and inspires creativity, or even just critical thinking in them. So you're looking for a positive shared experience in choosing books, particularly with the younger children, that you'll want to sort of look for a child's reactions to a particularly colourful picture book, that kind of thing. And in terms of narrative, you want books that will engage children. I don't think it's fair to ask children to read, boring books. And I very often come across this in book clinics where, children will sort of shamefacedly say, oh, I started this book, but I had to put it down, it was too boring. And that's fantastic, because I genuinely believe that life is too short for books that don't grab your attention. So I think children need to be empowered to make their own choices and to decide that books aren't for them. And not even just on a capability level, on an actual interest level as well, that they shouldn't be forced to read books that they really aren't interested in, because that can hinder their development of reading itself as something that they love. So what we want is, in terms of narrative, we want action-packed books, but we also want books that have a sort of an emotional life to offer the reader, and themes that they can discuss as well. In terms of tone, this is kind of a tricky one, and I have a lot of conversations with parents about this as well. Some children will respond very well to funny books, to humorous books. You're talking about the sort of the Dirty Bertie books, that kind of thing. That sort of that humor can really, really excite and interest in a child. But then other children will be drawn to more serious books, to more emotionally driven narratives, as I say, not as action-packed as others. So very much parents have the power to sort of, give their children a selection of books that really resonate within the parents' own values. And tone allows parents to sort of judge how their children will respond to those texts. As in, if their child is a naturally bubbly, funny individual, funny books will probably be the way to go. If they're sporty books again. And like I say, the inner emotional life of these books is incredibly important as well. In terms of language, it's a very fine balance, I think, to try and strike between what challenges a reader, but also what gives them that sense of comfort that they can read this. So you're looking for that balance of, new words, but not to overwhelm them, challenge them, but don't sort of, again, overwhelm them. You want language that helps them expand their vocabulary. So, I think parents worry about children plateauing in terms of their development as readers. but it's fine to plateau for a while, particularly if children are enjoying the books on the level at which they're actually reading it. But that language can be a lovely way to push their reading capabilities a little bit. It's almost like adding weights in a gym kind of thing, that once you're ready to move on, children will feel it themselves and will start to naturally look for books that challenge them a little bit more. And I suppose for choosing books for sort of younger readers, very much so what we want is how to express this, because a lot of parents will bring younger children to book clinics, and they kind of feel that there's so many picture books on the market. They wonder, what are the best ones, what are the most beneficial ones? And very often it's not necessarily the book itself, it's the way that it's introduced to the child, it's the way that it's used in the reading relationships, that a parent can take a very mediocre picture book and turn it into a wonderful reading experience if they have fun with it. And that's incredibly important to remember. But children respond very well to sort of dynamic colours, to very easily identifiable characters, something classic like the Very Hungry Caterpillar. It's clear, it's dynamic. The caterpillar itself is a prominent character throughout the entire narrative. And something like I Say Ooh and You Say Ah by John Kane, the donkey there with the underpants on its head, that gets laughs from children aged 2 to grandparents as well, I found at book clinics. And John Kane's text is a wonderful way of sort of illustrating how complex picture books can be and how meaningful and productive they can be for children to read, because the title I Say Ooh, You Say Ah, sounds, words, there's potential there for parents to point to themselves and to point to the child, to let them know that I'm myself and you're yourself, that there's a difference between the two of us. You say one thing, I say another. And it plays with sort of with color, with as I say, with dynamic storytelling as well. And it can be a chance for children to learn how to express themselves as well. And it's a picture book where not a lot happens technically, but it's very involving, it's very interactive. And Lost and Found would be an example of a picture book with that idea of an emotional inner life, in that, most of you probably know of Oliver Jeffers. This idea of Lost and Found is that the penguin is found by the little boy, and no one knows where the penguin has come from, and the objective is to get him home. But sort of spoiler, the penguin realizes and the boy realizes that home is actually something that they create themselves. So, while on one level it's a very simple picture book about a boy finding a penguin and going on an adventure, the sort of the underlying idea or moral or theme of it is the importance of home and of connection and of being together, which, is echoed in the fact that parents will be reading this with their child as well. And That's Not My Hat by John Klassen it's an example of a picture book that works on numerous levels, because I defy any adult to read it and not roll about the place laughing. It's absolutely gas, and children respond so well to the dry humour within the picture book as well. So like I say, these very sort of clearly identifiable characters, easy to follow stories, clear morals and notions that parents can really latch onto and play around with. That's what's important for choosing books for this kind of age group. And then for the slightly older children as well, sort of 5 to 7 and upwards, we're introducing what are called chapter books. So something like The Magician's Nephew or The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis is an example of a chapter book, in that it is a novel, but the chapters are quite short, so they're very manageable. So they're like a natural sort of development from picture books, that allow children to sort of gain that bit of independence in terms of their own reading. And also, not necessarily The Magician's Nephew, but something like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is also a movie tie-in. It's a film as well. Now, it's not a great film, but that's just my personal opinion. But, you can have conversations outside of the books then, that parents can watch the film with their children, read the book, and see whether they like which one they prefer. They can talk about the differences. So that expands the reading experience then, and it lets children know that, stories have all sorts of different manifestations, not just in books. Rabbit and Bear is an absolutely fantastic sort of more complex picture book, and that the emphasis on illustrations is still very, very intense. Every page is illustrated, and the text is quite large, so it makes it very easy for sort of beginner readers, or maybe like slightly tentative, reluctant readers and parents to read together. And as Neil Gaiman says in the blurb there, it really is laugh out loud. I've had numerous sort of initially uninterested readers, you know, their interest is sparked completely when I explain the dynamic of the relationship between Rabbit and Bear, and that Bear is, you know, the sort of the beacon of sense in the relationship, and she's constantly having to get Rabbit out of trouble. And I won't go into what Rabbit's bad habits are, but if anybody knows, you know, rabbits in real life, they can probably extrapolate, and that his favorite thing to talk about is not carrots. But like I say, this is an idea of sort of a funny book, but that the humor is pitched at sort of, you know, that kind of like not naughty humor, but that humor that will really, really let kids latch onto it and feel like they're having a sort of a you know, a sort of a personal joke with the book, which is incredibly important. And like I say, that emphasis on the relationship between the text and the images is beautifully laid out in a book like Rabbit and Bear. So it feels like a grown-up book, for want of a better phrase, because it doesn't look like a picture book. The format, it's quite a small book. So children can really see how they've developed from reading picture books to something like this. And at this stage as well, it's lovely to kind of let children explore their interests and that they don't necessarily have to be reading fictional narratives all of the time. Something like Professor Astrocat's space books are fantastic in that they're informative and children are learning, but they're still reading. There's this idea of, you know, sort of going to a book to find something out, which is an incredibly important thing to encourage as well. And they're great fun. These particular picture books, they come from a publisher called Flying Eye, who are very dynamic and produce an awful lot of non-fiction picture books, which have wonderful production values and really draw a child in, so that the information they're receiving, it's not, you know, it's not stale, it's not dry, it doesn't feel like a textbook because it is actually a picture book, but that they're enriching their, you know, other sources of information as well, and learning that books can function in different ways too. And I suppose for older children, I might start with Hilda and the Black Hound. This is a sort of a graphic novel or a comic book essentially. And I think, you know, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but, you know, parents kind of come to book clinics sometimes and say, you know, their son or daughter only reads comic books and that this is awful. And it's really not. Comic books and graphic novels are an incredibly productive way of reading because they're more complex, I think, than an awful lot of people realize, in that it involves an interaction between text and image and pulling out a story and sort of, you know, making assumptions about, you know, does the character's expression match the text that's describing it. All of these types of things are actually really wonderful skills, reading skills for children to develop. So comic books and graphic novels should always be encouraged. Mucking About by John Chambers is just a great funny book, which also kind of it sort of tells a very strange history of the sport of hurling, as I say, in a very sort of humorous tongue-in-cheek kind of fashion, which I think young boys particularly respond to, and it's great fun. And Wolf Hollow is this example of one of those books that sort of it asks quite a lot of the reader. It's a very subtle, understated narrative, very simply told. But you know, I've recommended this book to adults as well. So like there's a really, really strong emotional life within the book. And it's historical fiction as well. It's set in the 40s. And this can be a lovely way to introduce children to concepts, as in with historical fiction, you can talk about things like racism, slavery, these really hard topics that are especially relevant now because of Black Lives Matter. And you can allow children to explore them in a discursive fictional space, and then to come to you, or for them to come to their parents with questions, and that you can follow a character from that time within their own context as well. And that can be really, really important, as I say, in helping children sort of explore this idea that the past, you know, we are all human, therefore our common humanity unites us, but that things were once different in the past, and have they changed that much now, and should they continue to change more? So historical fiction can be a great way to have to start those conversations. And I won't talk too much about the trends in children's and young adult literature, just to touch on, as I said, that idea of the graphic novels and the comic books. And I really can't state enough how valuable those reading experiences are. You know, I think everyone remembers the Beano and the Dandy, you know, and the Bunty, but like these are incredibly complex texts, and children should be encouraged across the board to read comic books and graphic novels because they offer a different kind of reading experience. And the more diverse that reading experience is for children, the better. And particularly as well for, you know, I kind of have this term of reluctant readers, or, you know, readers who struggle. And that can mean anything from children who genuinely don't have an inherent love for reading and for whom reading is just work, and that's fine, or children who are living with dyslexia or have special educational and learning needs, in that they can still get all of the value and all of the sort of the development from reading, but they don't have to work as hard. That comic books and graphic novels can be incredibly attractive to children, because they can respond to the visuals. They can, in a way, let the visuals help them with the text. And that's wonderful. And it really does take the pressure off them. And, comic books and graphic novels, it develop, in different age ranges, just the same as fictional narratives. So, you can challenge children with comic books and graphic novels as well. It doesn't have to be on that one level all of the time. So I think if anything, I would very much empower parents to encourage their children to read comic books and graphic novels. Age banding is a bit of a funny one, and I suppose it's a general trend in children's publishers. As I say, I'm the 10 to YA editor for Inish magazine for Children's Books Ireland, and also every year we bring out a reading guide. And just, for sort of ease of access and ease of usability, we divide the guide up into age ranges. So we have 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 11, 10 to 12, 12 to 14, and then young adult books as well. And very often we find that the 9 to 11 category, which is my category for the last couple of years, is overwhelmed with submissions from publishers. But the 12 to 14 age range, we struggle to fill the section. And then YA or like teenage books, again, overwhelmed. But there's that weird sort of space in the middle where authors tend to write more specifically for the 9 to 11 age group, or the 10 or the YA age group. And it can be very hard then to find sort of appropriate books for that specific age group, the 12 to 14s, who may be quite advanced readers and are able sort of, in terms of capacity, to read quite advanced books, but you're looking for content as well. So I think parents can be very, it's hard to negotiate sometimes the age ranges, particularly in bookshops. And that's where I would encourage parents as well, to talk to librarians and talk to booksellers and find out why a particular book is in a particular age range. And very often it's a combination of, the sort of projected reading ability of the ideal reader, and also the issues or the themes that might come up in those books as well. So very often you'll find that in terms of language, the 9 to 11 and the 12 to 14 will be very similar, but that the issues covered in 12 to 14 might be a little bit more advanced than in the 9 to 11. And that's not usually made very apparent in bookshops or in libraries. So it can help to have those conversations with, the experts in both settings. And in terms of digital technology, I suppose, even over the summer, obviously, and before when the schools were closed, everything went digital, everything was online, and children, were looking at screens as a matter of course every day for their schoolwork. And the way that I see it is that, sort of iPads and Kindles and screens, they can enhance children's reading experiences, but, not replace them. That's incredibly important, because there really is no substitute for picking up a physical book. And that's not just a personal preference. It has actually been proven that children absorb more from the written page, the page that they can hold themselves, rather than from a screen. And I think that idea of sort of the traditional, in this sense, is not pejorative, that it's incredibly important that children have access to real books. I put real in inverted commas, but that's incredibly important as well. But that digital technology can be used to expand the reading experience, to look up a particular character in an historical fiction novel, to research, to find out more about certain ideas, that this expansion of the reading experience can be wonderful as well. But that really, it should be based in those sort of, like I say, the paper of the real book, if that makes sense. And to go back again then to that idea of supporting reluctant and struggling readers, I myself, I'm hoping to sort of do more research into supporting readers, particularly with dyslexia and autism as well. In terms of book clinics and in terms of interacting with individual children as part of CBI's mandate as well. But just in a sort of a general sense, reluctant readers and struggling readers, they're not the same, but their needs can overlap in that way. And reluctant readers, I find very often, they just haven't found the right book, or the right book hasn't been presented to them, if that makes sense. I mean, if you have I can think of numerous boys who've come into book clinics, usually around this sort of 10 years of age kind of mark. And, they're not interested in reading because they have, in their own heads better things to be doing, running around, to be catching up on, that kind of thing. But when you say to them, oh, you're into sports? And they say yes. And then I'm able to say to them, well, I have this book about soccer and I have this book about rugby. And, the stuff that they love is in those books, and yet the books are still of a high quality. They still offer the child a narrative experience. There's an emotional life to the characters who happen to be playing soccer, but it's the draw. It's getting the child just interested in the book and getting them hooked. That's the thing. So it's almost like flipping the switch, really, to help them kind of, to basically put books in their way that they're going to be interested in, and then they're starting from a good place. They're not having to work to get invested in a book that really they have no interest in the first place. And that idea of, especially if the adults in their lives are readers or were readers when they were younger, sharing books and talking about books that parents read when they were younger can really, really help reluctant readers, to kind of inspire them into saying, oh, well, if this was important to mum or dad when they were my age, maybe I'll give it a go. Sort of getting more into the struggling readers, their needs now. Like, probably with struggling readers, they might have problems in sort of multiple areas, and these can be compounded from from early childhood, or say junior infants onwards, that maybe children struggled with something like phonemic awareness, word decoding, phonics, this idea of recognizing the difference between words and hearing sounds, and being able to break words down and sort of using words on either side to help them figure out the meanings of words. And very often it can just be practice. That it's like with maths, with long division, if you practice it, the sort of the routine and the structure and the process of it will eventually click in. And sometimes reading can be like that as well, that it's just a matter of helping a child to practice, but yet not making it feel like it is practice, sharing it with them. And I find very often as well that children don't like to go backwards, as in if they have a favorite picture book from when they were younger and they get a bit older, even though they might still love that picture book, they find it very hard to sort of, admit that they want to go backwards. But that's where an adult can step in and say, look, I loved reading this book with you when you were younger. Would you read it with me again? And that can be a lovely way to help them refresh those reading skills and to get back into the habits that maybe, became a little bit stale for them as they went through school. And, to focus on fluency and comprehension issues, again, that's an idea of practice, that you could say, oh, I'd love, a parent could say, I'd love you to read me this paragraph. Would you do that? Or this page or this chapter, it's my favorite, and I'd love to hear you reading it. Because fluency is just another word for practice. It's helping children be confident with their reading styles and with reading out loud. And comprehension is helped by asking questions. The parents can, I don't mean to play dumb, but can really, facilitate proper discussions about characters and why a certain person might have felt a certain way, or why do you think this happened here and not there, all of these types of things. And really it comes across as just a conversation, but it's very, very meaningful and very, very beneficial as well. And motivation can be an issue for anyone, across the board in multiple different contexts, and children have to be motivated to do what they want to do. If reading is hard, they're not going to want to do it. So anything at all, like setting up little sort of reading challenges for them, little rewards, anything at all, depending on what the child's personality is. And this can, help them click back into this idea of, oh, reading is actually fun. That reading a couple of books a week might lead to a family board game night or something like this, just something to give them that little bit of extra added reward for what they're doing, because it's valuable and they need to know that they're doing something well. And like that we want struggling and reluctant readers as well to still be challenged and to be engaged, in that you have to sort of build that groundwork of the skills and the sort of the processes involved in reading, but you want to always keep that momentum going, that the child never feels like their progress has lagged in terms of the other children in their class or their friends or even brothers or sisters. And it's very important to have that conversation of each individual reads at their own pace as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. So this idea of rescuing reluctant readers, that reading switch that I talked about. If your child is into sports, find some good narrative sports books that they can get into. Interest in pastimes as well feeds into that. So if they're naturally very sort of, outdoorsy, action-packed books will be the best pick for them. And that idea of the democracy of reading, it goes back again to that idea of autonomy, that children really should be able to choose their own books, informed by the adults in their lives. So if it's a case of, an adult selects 4 books from the library and the child picks 2 of those 4 books, at least you're helping them frame their choice then within this structure of autonomy and agency. And the library comes into that idea of reading expeditions. And I'm aware that on today, like later on, that Dublin will probably be under stricter lockdown, so maybe libraries and museums won't be an option. But again, that's where the online idea comes in, of expanding the reading experience and turning it into a reading adventure, a research expedition, anything at all that makes them feel like reading is dynamic and that it has a proper place in the real world as well. Again, I've mentioned it already, but that idea of reading role models, that parents, and older brothers and sisters, anyone at all within the family, reading role models. If a child sees an adult in their life picking up a book, picking up a newspaper, a magazine, this is incredibly beneficial to them. And it's something so simple, but it really does make an impact. And I mentioned the film route as well earlier, and this particularly helps reluctant readers, as in it's almost like a reward for getting to the end of a book. They can watch the film version as well, and they'll feel empowered to be able to compare both. That maybe the book was much better, maybe the film is much better. We can see, but it also, like I said, expands the conversation around reading and gives readers a chance to kind of feel that they've achieved something by being able to watch the film afterwards. And it's all about balance. I mean, I think sometimes parents really panic if they feel their child is a reluctant or a struggling reader and they want to spend a lot of time practicing, they want to spend a lot of time reading. But it's all about balance. Every little thing, every little reading experience that happens throughout the day, and they happen even when a child reads, the name of a cereal on a cereal box, that's a reading experience as well. And it's all about balance, about not putting too much pressure on children to develop as readers, because it's an ongoing, a lifelong skill that they develop, and that nobody develops at the same pace. And that's incredibly important for parents and for children to know as well. And this idea of creative reading strategies, this I've had parents come to me, parents of sort of 11, 12-year-olds that say, oh, my child still loves to read with me, should I be starting to phase that out? I'm like, absolutely not. Keep going with that as long as the child will put up with it, basically, because it's time that will never come back again. And I fundamentally believe that reading helps children and parents develop their relationship. And it's something that it's so easily facilitated, but resonates deeply, throughout their lives, throughout that relationship. And just by sort of getting the most out of those early reading sessions when children are very small, this can lead then to moments, in later, sort of as children are moving towards puberty, that there's a great sense of familiarity and security, sort of ensconced in that reading relationship. And that if reading can be associated with positive interaction with parents, with sort of safety and security, that's something that they'll carry with them throughout their lives. So the idea of improvisation is that, especially before a child learns how to read, I think parents can feel, they can feel empowered to sort of step off the page a little bit and expand a particular aspect of a picture book or act it out, this kind of thing, and to encourage interaction with their children as well. I think the more a child interrupts you as you're reading, the better, because it means they're engaged in the book. If they ask questions, encourage the talking about books, and that when the book closes, that doesn't mean that the reading experience is over. The talking goes on and on. And reading everywhere, I think, is incredibly important as well. Like on the bus, in the park, anywhere at all in the house. Reading doesn't have to be confined to a specific place or a specific time. If a book goes into the bag when you step outside the door, then that's great, because there are reading opportunities everywhere. And I've already talked about that idea of reading outside of books, in terms of libraries, museums, the internet. And if a child expresses an interest in an aspect of a book, jump on it and go with it and see where it leads. It might lead to other books like it, to more reading experiences, or it might lead to a genuine interest in a particular idea or character. You never know where it might lead. And that idea of sharing childhood favorites as well, because these these are, you know, valuable memories from a parent's own childhood that they're choosing to share with their children, which in itself is incredibly meaningful, but it can also lead to something really productive in terms of how children might read classics or engage with classics as well. Like I say, library visits, I don't want to, you know, put too much emphasis on that, as I say, because of the impending restrictions that are coming down the line. But, you know, libraries are still open, you know, for people to call and have a talk, for people to order books as well. So that kind of bank of experience and know-how is still there. And then general tips, you know, this is just sort of like a recap of what we've been talking about, really. Parents as role models, those reading tools that I gave you at the start. Empathy and patience is incredibly important, because, you know, reading at the beginning is hard work, and even during it, it's hard work. You know, I think, you know, probably most of us have experienced that kind of sort of reading apathy throughout lockdown and, you know, the pandemic restrictions, that it was almost a worldwide phenomenon that people found it very hard to engage in books. So, you know, your child, well, the child's love for reading might come and go, you know. Other activities and occupations and pastimes, you know, can take precedence for a time. But once that bank of positive experiences with reading is there, then the child will always return to it in some way, shape, or form. Especially if that idea of routine is there, and the familiarity of knowing that there's a structure around reading in the house. And again, that idea of rereading, of allowing, I don't mean allowing, but sort of, you know, encouraging even children to read back over books that they read when they were younger, just to see if they get something different out of it. That can be a lovely talking point as well, you know, to encourage contemplation, to encourage them to think about the books that they read. That, as I say, once the book is closed, that doesn't mean the end of it, that an awful lot of children will think over what they've read. And you might even find them sort of acting out those stories in their imaginative play with their friends. This is all to be encouraged as well. And resisting comparison, and this can happen, you know, on from a child's perspective and from a parent's perspective as well. The children need to be empowered in terms of their individuality, that they read the way that they read, and that's incredibly special and important. You know, I think the best way to communicate this to children is to tell them that nobody else will read a book the way that they will. And that's wonderful, that's amazing, because nobody else is like them. And that kind of takes out the sort of the competition and the comparison. I mean, I think particularly, you know, for younger readers, junior, senior infants in first class, when they have their readers, their school readers, like the Oxford Reading Tree, where there are stages, and it's very easy to see the development, and it's very easy to notice that, oh, the child sitting next to me is on number 5 and I'm only on number 3. So to always have those conversations as well, but to empower, you know, the youngest children to the oldest children, to sort of take pride in their own individuality and into their, you know, to their reading identities as well. And the parents, you know, must always listen to their children talking about books. You know, even if you've heard this particular story up 10 times, it is that idea of listening, of responding, and of encouraging children to keep reading, no matter what it is. As I say, a graphic novel, a magazine, a comic, a book that they've read 100 times over. All of it is valuable reading experience. And I actually just have, you know, just sort of in lieu of questions from yourselves, I actually have a couple of questions here that some parents, you know, were sort of plagued with, I suppose, during the summer and in the pandemic specifically. And there was a couple of questions that I wanted to share with all of you. You know, that some parents were worried about children who love to read, but who seem to be sort of reluctant to become independent readers. And it was this idea of, you know, kind of cutting the apron strings, which, you know, it's not a thing that I see in terms of a reading relationship. I think it goes, you know, from zero right up to adulthood, when, you know, people can share books as grown adults as well. And there was one parent got in touch with me. She was specifically concerned for her little boy who loves books but says he hates reading. And that might sound like a contradictory notion, but it's actually not, in that some children do love books but hate the work of reading, and that's why they especially respond to shared reading with parents. But a simple solution to that, I think, to give children a bit of a break, but also to keep up their reading lives, is, yes, to encourage them to read comic books, but also to include or introduce audiobooks into their reading lives, because that lets them it takes the pressure off them, but they're still engaging with books, and it's developing their listening skills as well, their ability to retain information, because in a way, actually, it's harder to listen, you know, to a story than it is to read it yourself, because at least you have control over your own reading experience. So it tests a different set of skills and can be incredibly valuable but will offer a change to a reluctant reader as well, and will allow them to change up their behaviour a little bit. And then children can be encouraged then to engage with comic books and graphic novels again. So it's all about, you know, not panicking when a child seems to plateau or when a child seems to lose that love of reading. It's just about changing things up, giving them different options. And then it's not even about getting back on track. It's just about making their own path for them through the reading experience. And there was another question that came from parents who describe themselves as non-native English speakers. And so their child was as well, that their little girl, her English was not her first language, and they were worried about how her sort of language development and cognitive development might fall behind during lockdown when the schools were closed, and in comparison to her peers. And I think, again, it sounds like a specific question, but it goes back to that idea of consolidating reading experience and skills, in that I recommended to these particular parents that to go back to wordless picture books. And you know, there are numerous sort of different titles. Something like Journey by Aaron Becker is beautiful in that it follows a girl who draws a door into another world with a purple crayon, and it's completely wordless. And the illustrations are sumptuous and very detailed. So there's a lot to be taken out of the book, even though there are no words. And a sort of an idea was to tell the story of the book in their native language, and then to see if they could tell it in English, and to see what the comparisons were, and whether, you know, certain words were there in English that weren't there in their own language, and vice versa, and to find translations of classic stories. So say that Beauty and the Beast maybe in English, and then a version in their own language as well. So very, very sort of iconic stories, easy to grasp hold of and to retell then as well. So it's more about not worrying again about that comparison to be made between peers, but to sort of envelope the child in positive reading experiences, and to keep those reading experiences going. You know, even if it feels sometimes like regression, that a child may have been reading independently up until the lockdown happened, and then reverted to only being read to by their parents, but that's still an incredibly positive experience, and it's still a reading experience, which is really, really what we want to focus on. And I just want to give a quick sort of a push, I suppose, or a blurb for Children's Books Ireland, particularly as today is Culture Night. And President Michael D. Higgins will be sort of launching our Books Make Things Better guide. That was how we decided to sort of celebrate Culture Night this year. And there's a bilingual kind of aspect to it as well. We brought in Irish language text too. But on the Children's Books Ireland website, not only is Inish magazine available there to download, and Inish contains longer reviews of books, again from zero years to young adult books. And there are also resource packs for some of our titles there as well. Also reading guides like Bold Girls, which offers books that focus on strong female characters and role models, and reading guides as well, reading guides that go back to, I think, 2009. So these are basically snippet reviews of the best books that were published in that particular year, and these are reviewed by our team of reviewers and also then edited by myself as section editor and the other book doctors as well. So these can be incredibly valuable resources for parents who, you know, need advice on how to pick books for their children, and that the reviews, as I say, are very accessible, very short, and there's lots and lots of reading ideas there for children. And as I say, this is the Books Make Things Better poster. So it's Irish Children's Literature 2020, and it's just about supporting children's culture in Ireland essentially, and about, you know, making them feel like at least some things haven't changed, that books are still there for them, and that they still deserve the sort of the best stories. And I think that's probably it for in terms of the presentation. So I'm just going to exit out of that and let me see, bring Fergus back in if that's okay.
Rebecca, thanks so much for a really wonderful presentation. I can see by the comments that came in, a lot of very positive comments.
Oh, brilliant.
That people really got so many good ideas. It was really uplifting. That was fantastic. Thanks very much. We're a little bit tight on time, Rebecca, so I'm just going to read out some of the comments. There's a lot of people, as you spoke, commented on, oh, I like that idea, can you, etc. So that's okay. We might have time for too many questions, but So just bear with me a second. I can see that everyone's stayed with us, so that is fantastic.
Brilliant.
So 1 second, I'm just going to find where they started.
Great. And while you're doing that first, just to say again, my email, becky@ta21.ie. Like I say, any, you know, if people don't have time to stay for the questions, or if they have more kind of longer stuff, just email me, and you know, I'm always on the emails, so I'll get back to you. That'll be great.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So a few of the points I'll read out. Ellen Dillon saying 2 excellent points here. Having a designated time to read, such as bedtime, and also the point about vocabulary enrichment, whether that be through discussing what we read together or talking, sharing stories, conversations. This is so helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Ellen. And again, Ellen's good for timing in some kind of thoughts and comments, which is lovely. Learning words meaningfully by placing them in context immediately is another excellent, helpful point. Thanks, Rebecca.
And it really does work, you know, like I think expecting children to sort of remember words like lists, it, you know, it does no good, you know, but giving them the context really helps them embed them and to use them themselves then, you know, going forward.
And Mary Jordan's point is, I thought and agreed with Mary as you talked about it, Rebecca, the idea of the super dictionary, and love the idea of super dictionary and thought book. So thanks for those. Another point from Ellen, learning to read starts earlier than people think. Vocabulary enrichment as well as phonetic awareness through oral blending sounds to words can start when they're babies. Thanks for that, Ellen.
Parents sort of think like it has to have like a label, that they have to have a specific time, or we're doing phonemic awareness now, but it's talking, it's just, you know, engaging with children all of the time and making stories out of everything, you know, that's what works. You know, it doesn't have to have a label or, you know, a kind of a complicated jargon to it. Just talking is essential, you know.
Thanks. Okay, Pat Hoban saying, interested to hear what approaches one could use to enable children to become aware and articulate their own imagining the story, which you touched on at the start as part of pre or post reading activities.
Yeah, like I think you can set that up, you know, in terms of before a reading session, that children have it in their heads as they're going through it. You know, think about how the characters are feeling. Do you think you'd feel the same way if that happened to you? Would you do anything differently? You know, so it's kind of giving children it's incredibly important that children realize that like stories are not static, that you can pull them apart and you can put them back together again, that you can change it up, and that yes, they have a beginning, a middle and an end, but you can also, you know, mix those up and give stories different endings. When you retell something, it becomes yours. And I think helping children to sort of realize that yes, this is a character in a book, but you know, a real life person might do the same things as well, that kind of expands it out. And giving them the questions ahead of, you know, gives them the sense of what they might look for in the story as well. So you're kind of setting them up to succeed in talking about the book afterwards as well, and just drawing on their own experiences, you know, like that their lives are incredibly full, you know, emotionally, because they're learning everything for the first time. Everything is new. So by asking them those questions and kind of saying, you know, your opinion is important as well. And you know, you don't have to say that, but by asking them their opinion, they're realizing, oh, you know, what I think actually matters about this. And that's brilliant. Like that's exactly what we want. I mean, I've been you know, I used to be a TA in the School of English in Trinity, and I would have second year English students, you know, age 20, not realizing that their opinions about text mattered. So it's a lifelong thing, you know.
Okay, thank. Ellen Dillon is commenting on your information, on your points about comics. She says comics are amazing, different kind of reading experience and diverse. Totally agree. Thanks, Ellen.
Yeah.
Liam Ryan said, enjoying Rebecca's talk more than any I heard in a long time. Thanks to her and Nala. Thanks, Liam.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Phil.
Yeah. Ellen and Liam did tune into all our, I know the name, he's tuned into all our reading webinars, so that's strong praise, Rebecca, because they've all gone really well. So Ellen Dillon saying, digital resources should enhance but not replace reading from paper-based resources. Yes, totally agree with Rebecca. Children do absorb more from the written paper than from the screen. And I think it's true for adults as well. Thank you for your, I'm just, it's gone off the bottom of the page. Thank you for making that point. Okay. Ellen's also saying that's key. Practice, repetition, routine. The more it's done, the more it lodges in the long-term memory. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
You know, and we can't hop up on a bike the first time.
Sorry.
Yeah, just saying, you don't hop up on a bike for the first time and just fly off and do the Tour de France. You know, you have to build up the skill, and that's what it is. Like, it doesn't happen by magic. You know, reading is magic, but learning to read is actually something that you have to practice, you know.
Yep. Another point from Ellen saying having a reading role model is so effective, because I always attribute the fact that my family weren't big readers to the fact that it took me until later in life to get into reading. Yeah. And Ellen again saying reading doesn't have to be confined to a specific place or time, because there are reading opportunities in many places. I love that. So thanks, Rebecca.
Everywhere. I mean, you know, even walking through the city or the town wherever you live, you know, and pointing at billboards or, you know, signs on bus stops, it's all reading. And I think people kind of forget that you know, it doesn't just have to happen in a book, it can be anywhere.
Yeah. Ellen saying, I've never even thought of that idea of resisting comparisons that we're individuals. That's powerful. Breeder Ryan had to leave, but she said, apologies to all, I have to log off due to a prior appointment. Thanks very much for a great webinar, explanations and recommendations. Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Eva Brown is saying, excellent webinar, wonderful and useful information. So that's strong.
You know, because like I said, an awful lot of this is like my personal sort of research interest, and it's so lovely then to have a bank of, you know, practitioners and interested people to say, yes, this actually does make sense, and it's not just me that thinks this, you know.
Okay, Ellen Dillon saying, powerful. And this is about your webinar, Rebecca. Thanks so much. Uplifting is the word. That's great. Anne-Marie Foley saying, this was brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca. And so much of it is useful for older readers also. Sorry, I missed some of the start because of the sound, but I explained to Anne-Marie that I've recorded it all and it'll be all on the NALA YouTube channel by next Monday or Tuesday. Alison Wells saying, wow, thanks, that was brilliant. So comprehensive and lots of practical ideas. If you have a chance, could you quickly say again about reading expeditions?
Yeah, like, I mean, as I say, you know, I'm so conscious that now, like, Dublin is going to go, as I say, into more, you know, kind of advanced restrictions because of the pandemic. But like the obvious ones are the library or a museum, any kind of cultural spot. I mean, somewhere like here in Wexford, we have the cultural heritage and the Heritage Park. But, you know, a trip to the Heritage Park is fine, it's a day out. But there's Neolithic history that happens there, so that can turn into an internet search, that can turn into a trip to the library. You know, what would people in Neolithic Ireland have thought? Would they have told stories? Would they have had dogs? You know, the questions they're literally endless. You know, or a trip to the seaside can turn into, oh, what do fishermen do? Oh, do we know any stories about fishermen? So like it's endless. Like the capacity for it is just exponential once, and you know, the children love to ask questions. So like once you kind of realize, oh, like I don't have to have the answers. The actual joy and the meaning is in finding the answers. That's great. And that can turn into non-fiction or fiction either, you know, both are valuable.
Thanks, Rebecca. Great point here. And sort of following on from what you've just said from Edel Flannery. Fantastic presentation, so much in it to take on board. I wrote a short family literacy program with asylum seekers aged 4 to 16 this summer based on Irish myths and legends. The participants then shared stories from their cultures. It worked really well because of the commonalities and themes between stories such as heroes, magical animals, mystical features such as rivers and lakes, etc. That's lovely. Edel, could you do me a favor, please, and send me your email address? I know your name so well, but I just can't think who you are. Maybe I could chat to you about you doing a webinar on this or a workshop with some ESOL students, because that sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
So thanks, Edel, for that.
Me, I'd love to have a chat about that as well, because that's right up my street. That sounds fantastic. I'd love to hear more.
Edel, you have to email me and Rebecca. I'll let you email her first, because she did all the work today. So you have her email from her presentation there, and my email is fdolan@nala.ie, but I know your name well. I just can't think where you're from. I think Claire, but I can't remember. Okay, Isabella Daly saying, best ever, more time needed. And you went on until about 12:15,
no.
Rebecca, and she's still saying best ever, more time needed. So if you'd have gone on to 1 o'clock, they wouldn't have left. So that's high praise indeed. Edel Flannery says, this presentation will inform my future design of programs. Thank you. Okay, thanks, Adele. Mary Jordan saying, I'm off to the library to choose books for a 3-year-old I'm babysitting over the weekend. I want my hat back, because I knew Very Hungry Caterpillar and Lost and Found, and my kids love those, but I don't know. I want my hat back. They're too big, but I'll read it and pretend it's for them, but it's for me. Okay.
It's gas. Honestly, you laugh out loud. It's fantastic.
Last point from Adele Flannery. We're going to have to sign off, guys. Thank you both. I'll send all my details. Thanks, Adele. Okay. Listen, it just leaves me to say thanks again to Rebecca for a really wonderful and uplifting webinar. This has been great. The comments have been superb, fantastic, positive. I didn't make any of them up. Everyone stayed with us till the end. We're supposed to be finished around 12 at the latest, and Rebecca went on 12:15. It's now nearly 12:30. So it's a testament to how powerful and uplifting it was that people have all stayed with us. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for tuning in. I know you got lots of ideas and tips and are motivated and uplifted and ready to rush to the library and all that kind of thing. So listen, thanks again. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good weekend. Rebecca, I'll ring you for what do you call it?
The debrief.
Debrief. Thanks, Rebecca. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks so much, Fergus.